Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening from wherever in the world you may be joining us. And today, my name is Jeroen de Wolf. I am the director of the UC Berkeley Institute of European Studies. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's event with Dr. Spero Simeon Paravantes and his book on Britain and the United States in Greece. And this is the book that we will be discussing at today's event. I do need to start with an apology to all of you in the audience, and especially to our speaker. We had a transition to a new staff member at our institute, and unfortunately, during this transition, there was a miscommunication about the date of the event, so please do accept my apologies for this. In any case, I am very pleased to see so many of you here today with us. I would like to inform that today's event is organized in the context of our Modern Greek and Hellenic Studies program, which is a brand new program at our Institute of European Studies, a program that was created with the generous support of the Modern Greek Studies Foundation, and that recently also received additional support from the Ilios Foundation, the Pancretan Foundation, and the Kounalakis family. We're obviously very grateful for this support. I should also say that today's event is co-sponsored by our colleagues from the UC Berkeley Institute of Slavic, Eastern European, and Eurasian Studies. We have Dr. Spero Paravantes with us today to present his latest book on Britain and the United States in Greece, Anglo-American Relations and the Origins of the Cold War, a book that was published recently with Bloomsbury Press. Allow me to briefly say a few words about today's speaker. Dr. Spero Paravantes is an international historian. He is a visiting professor at the Catholic University of Milan and also a senior research scientist at the Robert Schuman Initiative for European Affairs at the University of Luxembourg. We're also honored to have Spero associated with us at our Institute of European Studies here in Berkeley as a senior fellow. I will be assisted today by my colleague Christine Filiou as co-moderator. Christine is a professor at the Department of History here in Berkeley, and she is also the director of our recently created Modern Greek and Hellenic Studies program. So a warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. The way things will work is that Spero will start the event with about a 20-minute introduction to his new book, which will be followed by a Q&A with Christine and me. Now, during the conversation, all of you in the audience are encouraged to write down your own questions in the chat function on Zoom. And then my colleague Ray Savard will be passing on a selection of these questions to me and Christine. And during the Q&A, we will select some of these questions and pass them on to our speaker. I do want to ask people in the audience to please mute yourself during the event in order to avoid interruptions. So allow me now to pass on the floor to Spero and to ask Spero to start with a brief presentation of his book. So Spero, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Jeroen. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we all hear you very well.
Okay, super. Well, look, first of all, thank you so much for that nice introduction. And thank you very much, Christine and Jeroen, for arranging everything today. And to Ray as well for the technical support and all the organization behind the scenes. Really appreciate it. And to all of you for joining, thank you so much for joining us again. It is really for me to see the level of interest in the subject in general and in the book in particular. So it's really, really special to me. But before I do get into the book, I would like to just say a couple of things about my experience at Berkeley. Berkeley was really inspiring for me. I finished a draft of the book there. And Jeroen, you're very kind to say that the honor is yours, but truly the honor is mine to be associated with Berkeley. I'm very proud of that. and especially my association with the IES. And I want to let everybody know that the environment that Jeroen has created there is unique. It's very welcoming, it's supportive, it's collegial, and it's inspiring. And so whatever I was able to do with this book, a great deal of that is due to my experience at Berkeley. So I would like to thank you as well for that. And I do have a presentation. I'll start sharing my screen. All right, can everyone see this? That's good.
Very good.
Okay, super. Well, this is what I'll talk about today is I'll go over my motivation for the book, what it's about, then cover my approach, methodology, and how they shape the narrative, and then share just a few of my findings, a couple anecdotes, and then some concluding remarks before we move on to the Q&A. Now, in short, this is my motivation for the book. It's a photograph of my father at the age of 3 in the town of Argos in the Peloponnese in October, November 1944. And it was taken just after liberation. He'd gotten lost. And these 2 British soldiers found him and they brought him back to the central square where my grandfather saw him and took the photo. And this photo for me also, it shows how events like this do get frozen in time, that the passage of years does not really change in how we perceive these events. And now we're sitting almost 80 years after the events of the book, but it's not that far away. These events, even though my brother and I grew up in Western Canada and had nothing to do with these things directly, these events still were a part of our family, a part of our family's identity, like it was for thousands of other families. And so the book that, or the Greece that I deal with in the book is one that is devastated by the occupation and the Civil War. And the findings of the UN talk about Greece saying that only the USSR per capita had been more devastated than Greece. It was a country where there were 800,000 casualties, 1 million internal refugees, 1,000 villages had been wiped out. 90% of the merchant marine and the railways were gone. The ports were inoperable. 70 to 80% of the livestock was gone. And it was a series of ongoing social, political, and economic crises. Conditions were so bad that Greece only reached its 1939 levels of production by 1952. And so Greece is well behind the rest of Europe in 1952 when they're well on their way to recovery. And so this is the Greece that my book deals with. It's the Greece that the British and the Americans are confronted with when they come to the country after liberation in October 1944. And so today is a culmination, and I hope not the culmination, but a culmination of my attempt to reconstruct this period in time, perhaps more clearly than has been done before in regards to this subject. And so what is it about generally? Well, it's about trying to fill in this picture of the early Cold War relationship of the British and the Americans. And in that reconstruction, that picture, there is the Greek Civil War as an intervening variable. And look how the British used the Civil War to influence US policy. And it also highlights the uncertainties of intervention and institution building. And more specifically, the book tells 2 stories. The first is how British and US policy from 1946 1952 influenced the course of the Greek Civil War and its aftermath, but also how the British and US experience in Greece affected their relationship. And to do that, I had to develop a bit of a new methodology. I didn't think that these 2 stories could be told separately, and I had to figure out a way to tell them together. And so I did have a theoretical and a practical basis, and the theoretical basis had 3 parts. One, I borrowed this term from social science called the law of unanticipated consequences. But what it states is that whenever intervention occurs, planned intervention into a complex system, such as a country, there will be unanticipated consequences, things that you cannot predict occur. And so this is not only a counsel to policymakers, but also to researchers. When we're looking at these events and things are happening, to be aware that likely many of the things that are happening were not anticipated. And following that was to keep myself open to the possibility that two or more explanations which may appear contradictory superficially may also be true simultaneously. And this is critical to not discard nuance or contradiction. Often when we're looking at the human past, it reveals contradiction on a wide scale. We need to somehow keep those in mind and not allow that to shut down the reasoning process or shut down the research that's taking place. And a key way to do that as a historian is the concept of historicism. Historicism counseling us that the events, the locations, the pressure of the time influence the production of the evidence we consult. Meaning to properly understand them, we need to be aware of that context. But what I found in this book through the course of my research is that the context also came from the documents themselves and their relation to one another. And this is what I describe in the intro as that dual track approach. So again, the historicism that I wanted to just highlight was that I need to keep in mind the events, the locations, the pressures of the time influencing the evidence. So being aware of the historical context in which these things were produced. But also for this book, the context that they provided each other, that looking at these documents side by side, date by date, event by event, government to government, provided a context that I don't think had been provided before. And these are the sources that I used predominantly, and not exclusively, but these are the main ones: the British Foreign Service, US State Department, various embassies and international organizations, but also diaries, journals, biographies. I really wanted to try and get a sense of the policymakers, who they were as individuals, and how that played into what they were doing. And also then, to focus in that research on these four key areas, these four institutions, the institutions of the monarchy of government, the economy, the military and police, and the Civil War. Sorry, the Civil War not being an institution, but these are the four elements that I wanted to focus my research on. And what emerges is this matrix of diplomacy, or a culture of diplomacy, the ebb and flow of ideas, not only between governments, but between branches of government. And it highlighted that even certain things that may seem superficially perhaps not that important, nonetheless illustrate a culture within that particular office or that particular time that influenced policy. And it allowed me to uncover findings which until now were not known or well understood. And I'm going to highlight a few of those now. The first is that British intelligence services in Greece during the occupation were ignored by the Foreign Office. And this will have ramifications. As early as 1943, the British Foreign Office intended to return the Greek monarchy to Greece, but British intelligence was telling them that this was a very unpopular position, that the majority of the resistance groups were at best indifferent and at worst hostile to the idea of returning the monarchy. And the Foreign Office didn't want to hear it. And as a result, at liberation, the Special Operations Executive, or British liaison officers, British saboteurs, spies, and army officers that had been in Greece since 1942, that had very detailed information about the country, the players, the various groups, their motivations, were removed. The Foreign Office pulled them out and deprived themselves of over 2 years of very detailed corporate knowledge of the country. And less than 2 months later, the British would be fighting the communists in Athens in what was called the second round of the Civil War. The December events, the Kembriana, from December 15th roughly to January 15th. And the second thing that was surprising was the Labour Party's anti-communism, their misinformation, and the subsequent reversal of these during the third round of the Civil War. Britain wanted to use Greece and the crises there, the economic, political, and military crisis, to lure the United States into Greece. The idea was using American power to, at first, by time to try and rebuild the empire. And if that wasn't possible, then at least to maintain their status as an international player. And if that wasn't possible, then at least to protect their strategic interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. And Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin saw US intervention in Greece as key to meeting these objectives. And so what he did, he came up with this idea in 1946, was to force the hand of the United States. And they said to the State Department in 1946 that Britain is bankrupt, our troops are all going to be pulled out by 1947. And by all accounts, this shocked the State Department. It spurred them into action because they've been hearing from the British until this point that Greece is really in danger of falling to the communists. And if the West doesn't intervene, it could fall. And they are pressured into action. We know the Truman Doctrine is planned and then declared in 1947. The Marshall Plan is declared. In 1948, the first Marshall Plan aid comes to Greece. So they're very effective. But we know that the British exaggerated this because British troops stayed until 1948. They kept their troops even longer. Once they knew the Americans were coming, the pressure to remove their troops diminished, and they kept them there in spite of that. And what also is occurring is that by the time the Americans come in, the anti-communist rhetoric and the anti-communist information the British are sharing has actually exacerbated conditions. And to the point, diplomats are now trying to rein in anti-communism in 1948 and 49 on the part of the Greek government and the Americans. They're worried, and a number of them start saying that if these trends are not reversed, it's going to take us to a very dark place. And they're very prescient in those concerns. And following up on the first finding, the failure of the Varkeza Accord and the 1946 elections and 1947 plebiscite. Now I put these in parentheses because the plebiscite and elections are actually supposed to be held in the opposite order. And what is not well highlighted in the literature is the fact that one of the key elements of the peace treaty ending the December events was the promise to hold a plebiscite before elections. And the problem with that for the British is, as we've seen, that returning the monarchy was one of their longest standing policy objectives for Greece, and it had not changed with the election of a Labour government. It had become non-negotiable. But at the time, in 1945, the king was very unpopular, and there's a real possibility that they would not win that plebiscite. So the British decided to reverse the order. The idea being, if you hold the plebiscite first, you give the participants the choice of republic or constitutional monarchy. If you hold elections first, you maintain that constitutional monarchy until public opinion shifts enough to vote in support of maintaining it. And what they did is they had the Greek government ask for this change to occur and then supported it. And the State Department supported it, saying since they had made no public declaration in support of the terms of Varkeza, they were not bound to support it and could instead support the request of the Greek government. And not surprisingly, this provokes a very strong reaction, not only from the communists, but from non-monarchists such as Republicans. But it sets the stage for the final round of the Civil War, the transition from guerrilla to open warfare, which occurs in 1946-47. Now, what also struck me throughout the course of the book are the repeated enlargements of the Greek army, time and time again, to a maximum size of 500,000 soldiers in 1949. In spite of the diplomatic record containing numerous references to lamentable progress in the Civil War, and also to the Joint Chiefs of Staff releasing a statement, a classified statement, but saying that, in their opinion, that should the communist countries invade, Greece's borders were indefensible. And the army's role then was not to defend the country, but rather to maintain prestige and internal security. And that was a striking thing to read from the State Department and the Joint Chiefs, because it highlights a switch in roles that is traditionally reserved for the police. The military is supposed to defend the state against its external enemies. The police are supposed to preserve internal order and security. And from the late 1940s, that role in Greece was blended between the two. And finally, there was a precedent established for bypassing the UN Security Council. And it was done in the context of the United Nations Special Committee on the Balkans, #1, and number 2 in 1947 and 48. As the Civil War was continuing its third round, there were calls internationally to investigate why it was still going on and what could be done to stop it. And in the Security Council, the solution was to send a committee to investigate. It was composed of representatives of the permanent and non-permanent members. But very quickly, the findings of the committee 1 and 2 reflected the divisions that were going on internationally. The communist members of the committee insisted the committee investigate only the domestic conditions that were contributing to the ongoing conflict. And the Western members of the committee insisted that only the crises on the northern borders of Greece be investigated as causes of the conflict. Now, obviously, both were responsible. The internal conditions, there were repeated and increasing repression of the left in terms of their newspapers. There were summary executions, summary detentions and imprisonments taking place. In the north, there were repeated violations of the border, arms and medical supplies being transferred from Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, or Albania to the Greek Communist Army, or the Greek Communist Army was permitted to go into to cross the border freely to avoid capture and re-enter somewhere else. And there was also the issue of the thousands of children that were being held in Yugoslavia, the Greek children. And so the fact that the committee reflected these international divisions basically guaranteed that they wouldn't be able to propose a solution. And when an impasse was reached, both at the committee level and then in the Security Council, with the Soviets threatening to veto any resolution that drew any reference to the crisis on the northern borders, the US decided to bypass the Security Council and went straight to the General Assembly to get a resolution. Now, up to now, the first well-known occurrence of US bypassing the Security Council in this way was in Korea, when the Soviets vetoed resolutions in the Security Council condemning the North Korean invasion of the South. So the US took it to the Security Council, to the General Assembly, excuse me. And what I found is that precedent was established in Greece in 1948. And there's just a couple of anecdotes too I'd like to share, just things that kind of stick with me too after those findings. The first is this, and it's from the annual report of Ambassador Clifford Norton reporting to his government in December 1946. And he says that the sufferings caused by the war and the occupation, the growth of the Greek maquis, its demolitions, and the inevitable German reprisals, the final outbreak of civil war and its suppression by British troops have left, besides material destruction, black memories, vendettas, fears, and hatreds which will not die out in our time. And this statement was remarkable because we find statements similar to this later on in the diplomatic record, but he was among the first that starts reflecting on what their policies are, where they might lead. And finally, there's a report. It's one I used to finish the book. From the ambassador degree, the US ambassador to Greece, Ambassador Purifoy, and he reports on a meeting he had with King Paul. And King Paul is informing the ambassador that the current government under Plastiras is not well liked, not very competent. It will fail. It's likely to fail. And when it does, he'll remove Plastiras as prime minister and appoint a caretaker government. And in the interim, we'll get the head of the armed forces, Field Marshal Alexander Papagos, to resign from the military, form a new party, run for PM in new elections, which he does. And he certainly doesn't give up his influence over the military or the police. But he resigns, he becomes prime minister in 1952. And in 1953, the CIA begins training Greek army officers in anti-communist tactics, how to set up covert cells in the Greek military, training them how to seize power if necessary, should a communist infiltration occur. And one of the most notable officers to take part in this program is Yorgos Papadopoulos, who leads the coup in 1967. And so trying to come to a summary is a little bit difficult, but I think I can break down at least part of the book in this way, by saying that at least by attempting to accomplish so many different objectives internationally and domestically in Greece at the same time, Anglo-American policy from 1946 to 52 failed to achieve those most crucial to achieving recovery and healing. The focus goes increasingly from stable democracy to stable rather than democracy. As we get through 48, 49, 50, you see that all that they're interested, all that the Americans are interested in at this point is stability. And you can understand part of it in the context of the world as it existed in 1950 with Korea. But the Roosevelt's anecdote about making the world safe for democracy, but not necessarily democratic, certainly takes on an ominous meaning in the context of Greece at this point. Because these failures in 1952 are not immediately or at least fully apparent, but they do become so in 1967. The way that these institutions were created, supported, and trained would end up allowing them to rob the country of the freedom it had striving for throughout its history. And they allowed democracy, I'm quoting myself in the book here, they allowed democracy to be done away with, exactly what they had feared the communists would do. And in so doing, became what they beheld. Now, on this uplifting note, I think I'll stop there. There are some uplifting things to talk about, but I ended on a little bit of a downer. But again, thank you so much, Jeroen and Christine, for this. And now I'd like to turn over the virtual floor to you and to everyone else for questions and comments. And I have my contact information here too. For anyone that does have questions or comments, I'd love to get in touch with you. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Spero. Thank you so much. This was excellent. So let me then start the Q&A with the first question, and also remind everyone that you have a chance to participate in the Q&A with questions that you can post in the chat. And I see that already some people did that, and I encourage all of you to do the same. But let me start our conversation, Spero, with one sentence from the book that really intrigued me. And let me read it to the people in the audience. At one point, you write in your book, the book shows how the methods and justifications for intervention and institution building in Greece were used as models for future interventions elsewhere, and the perceived mistakes in Greece were used to shape subsequent policies. So essentially what you're saying here is that your study on Greece is a fascinating case study, but at the same time, you're also saying that what happened in Greece had much broader ramifications at a global scale, right? So I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on this.
Yeah, certainly. Look, there's a number of ways and in different areas. One of the first was in the person of C.M. Woodhouse. And he's an interesting guy. He was a Cambridge-educated scholar, joined the British military, parachuted into Greece as a liaison officer, spoke Greek perfectly, integrated himself, knew the country very well, and after the war wrote the first books that really established the historiography of this field. But then he kind of disappears for a while, and he reappears in Iran in the 1950s, working with Kermit Roosevelt in the CIA, and are responsible for installing the Shah, the coup that overthrows Mossadegh and installs the Shah. So there's one. The way that the police were reformed, they brought in an expert from Ireland, a man called Sir Charles Wickham, who was notorious in his role in the British suppression of the Irish revolutions in World War I and the period afterwards. And he's brought into Greece to reform the police, to run the prisons. And the focus at what I end my presentation with, that focus on stable rather than democracy too has implications. The government of South Vietnam is not a representative, a liberal democracy, but it's supported. Korea spends a long time before it reaches a liberal democratic status, South Korea. So there are, for me, and the precedent as well with bypassing the UN. If you can't reach an accord, or you can't meet your objective in the Security Council, well, here's a way to bypass here's a way to make it. So Greece really, and those are just the thoughts off the top of my head, but in those ways are the first ones I can think of where that numerous precedents were established.
Excellent. Christine, I'll pass it on to you for the next question.
Yeah, can I ask my own question?
Sure.
Okay, great. I just want to say, first of all, I really appreciated that this was not about the Greek War of Independence because everything this year is about that, and it was really refreshing.
Sure, 200 years.
About this period instead, which is equally fascinating. And I just wondered, I guess I love the fact that you're actually using diplomacy as a field of analysis instead of the old fashioned diplomatic history where you would just be reporting what one person said to another, right? And I fully agree with that, and I think it's really illuminating. And I just wondered, I don't know, if we go to an example like the percentages agreement that you deal with, which is always kind of I don't know, that kind of symbol of the fact that at the end of the day, through all of this bloody struggle, the conflict was already decided before it even began, right? By Stalin and Roosevelt and whatnot. And so looking at that and looking at all that you've been able to unpack about the US-UK dynamic and relationship, do you feel like it changes the answer to that question? Like, so Greeks within Greece who are used to discussing this on a whole different level, right, within themselves about the two factions, whatever. Do you feel like the addition of this level, what then did Greeks at the end of the day have any more or less agency than we thought they had? Does that make sense?
Oh, no, absolutely. Well, and the thing is, if we flip it a little bit, I mean, it was the Greek institutions. It was the Greek military, the Greek police, the Greek government. It was the Greek economy. It was their institutions. And so ultimately there is a large amount, if not the majority of the responsibility on the institutions. But having said that, you can also see the unfortunate position of Greece geographically and historically, always kind of in this way, that it's seen as a potentially important regional, I hesitate to say power, but a regional player. But whatever is best for Greece is overruled if that conflicts with what is perceived to be of better interest of the major powers. And in terms of, and the Soviet Union, where the position, Stalin obeyed or honored the percentage agreement that he made. For him, it was if the communists win, bonus, but I'm certainly not risking anything for them. And that wasn't apparent to the British or the Americans until 48, 49, when they start seeing there is a split between Tito and Stalin. And they finally realize that, oh, actually, it's not the Soviet Union, it's Tito that is fueling at least the crisis on the northern borders. So there's a bit of a revelation there, but it still doesn't change the way that the Americans at that point decide to support the Greek government going forward. There's very little attempt to force reform. And so it also highlights this interesting question of control, because I think often we have myself, as researchers as well, we have a simplistic view of intervention and thinking, okay, they're a superpower and they're just going to push the smaller countries around. There's a bit of that that's true. There's certainly influence, but control is something else. And repeatedly throughout the records, the diplomatic records, show intense frustration on the part of the British and the Americans that they're not getting the Greek government to act in a way that they want. So you have these multiple lines of, I hesitate to say truths, but you have these conflicts and these conflicting, conflicting narratives and conflicting objectives that are happening simultaneously. So it's very, very, I don't know. Sorry, maybe I'll stop there. I'm sorry, did that answer your question? I started rambling a little bit at the end of my thinking.
Great. No, that was great. And so I could also read a question from the audience. Is that?
Yeah, maybe I go and then you go after me again. So we rotate, Christine.
Okay.
And I do have a question from the audience as well, from our librarian, Spero, who used to live in Athens actually before he came to Berkeley.
Okay.
And who wants to know more about the diaries? Because you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, right? The diaries
Sure.
play an important role. So could you tell us a little bit more? What type of diaries were they? Were they published? And in what way did they influence your study?
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, too, I'd say if he is interested too, he or she, I'm sorry, I assume.
He. Yeah.
Good, but feel free to send me an email too, and I can send you a bibliography as well, so I can give you the reading. There's wonderful diaries from, you name it, Churchill, Eden, Attlee, Bevan, and Ambassador McVeigh at first, Secretary of State Acheson. There's also the complete correspondences between Roosevelt and Churchill that are very important for the early part of the book. And then there's Truman's diaries as well, which are extremely enlightening, the way he saw himself and the role that he fashioned for himself in the new Cold War. And let me think. Yeah. Oh, you know, there's an easy way for me to do this as well. And there are a number of diaries from. There was a record of the KKE's General Secretary, published in 1945, that I found in Simon Fraser's library, of all places, an original copy that was fascinating to read. And it was a record of his record of events in English to be transmitted to the British and the Americans prior to Varkaza, which was a fascinating read. It was called The White Book. Yeah, so that's what I have for you at the moment, but I'd be more than happy to send the list send the bibliography so that you can get a detailed list of those.
Excellent. Spero, let me pass it on to Christine again. Christine, go ahead.
We have another really interesting question from the audience. What was the role played by Albania during this period as far as assisting the insurgents in Greece? Did this role have a damaging effect on Anglo-Albanian relations in the following decades?
That's a wonderful question. Okay, let me start answering it this way. The interest with Albania, in Greece, when you talk about the border with Albania, it's always northern Epirus, northern Greece. And the Albanians, it's always southern Albanian. So even though they're talking about the same geographical region, the way they describe it and conceive of it is completely different. And that I think illustrates a little bit what would I say? How would you say that? Well, a difference in paradigm, a difference in worldview. First of all, for us it's the north, for you it's the south. There is a dispatch that I read, where the Greek Communist Army fled into the border of Albania, and the Greek National Army wanted to pursue. They stop at the border. They contact the British ambassador, say, listen, can we go into Albania to get these guys? And of course the British say, no, you can't. And then privately, reporting back to the Foreign Office, they say, if only they would do it without asking us permission. So what does that mean for Anglo-Albanian relations? Well, they're part of the communist bloc, but they're not in a position of Yugoslavia, and they're not in a position of Bulgaria, Romania, or Poland either. And so they're just very, very isolated for most of the Cold War. I haven't, in the stuff that I've looked at, I haven't found an overly negative impact as a result. The British never gave their approval to the Greek National Army to pursue the communists. But certainly there were protests. There were diplomatic level protests from the British to the Albanians to close the border, to not allow any supplies through, or to not allow the Greek communist forces into their territory, which were ignored until about 1949. And when the Greek Communist Party is still devoting itself to Stalin, and they kind of insult Tito, and they keep trying to show that they're actually Stalinists, they're not Titoists. And Tito says, well, I've been giving you all the support. He ends that in the interest of trying to also play a bit of a middle game between the Soviets and the West. And so the Greek communists just get caught in that, and the Albanians close their border at the same time. So ironically, it's not it's not so much the British that have a role in that, but it's actually the internal Balkan politics that play a dramatic role at the end of the conflict. So I hope that partially answers the question, at least.
Yeah.
And follow-ups by email are most welcome.
Thank you, Spero. Let me follow up with a different question, and this time from one of our scholars associated with the German Historical Institute here in Berkeley, who asked us the following question: would you describe the crackdown on the left during and after the Civil War as a precondition for the build-up of the transnational state-behind army in Operation Gladio? Could this be part of CIA operations in the early 1950s?
I haven't seen anything directly showing that it is. What I did see was about the program I described at the end, where they were training Greek army officers. So it's certainly possible. There is a lot of stuff that is coming out now about the CIA in the Balkans and in Greece that was not available 10 years ago. And I would be happy. It's a fascinating question, but I don't have a better answer than that because I haven't seen it yet.
Thank you, Spero. So good to see you again.
Likewise.
Let me go back to Christine.
Yes, there was an interesting question about Portugal, and I wanted to jump on that and add Turkey to the question. And so Michael Goodman says, Portugal was a charter member of NATO, although it was hardly democratic during this period. And I am thinking about Turkey in this whole, as I was reading the book, and because it's so similar and so different at the same time. And it's another simultaneous recipient, I guess, of this Anglo-American, emergent Anglo-American policy, right? The Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, even though Turkey wasn't even in the war. And Turkey, rather than having an actual, and I do mention this in passing actually in the book that I just did, that Turkey is not torn asunder like Greece. It does not have a civil war, but it's forced to transition to a quote unquote multi-party system, which we can discuss how in earnest that was. But so how do you, so is it, would you say that out of these tensions and this dynamic between the UK and the US, is there sort of, are there actual specific criteria, tenets that they're trying to bring everyone in line with? Or is it really about gaining control to intervene and institution build in whatever the different environments are that they're intervening in, right? So Turkey, Iran, Greece, Portugal, Korea, whatever it is. Are they trying to bring about some kind of homogeneous vision for all these things? I mean, we know on one level, aspirationally they were, but how do you see it actually playing out on this level of analysis that you've put out for Greece?
Yeah, well, look, certainly, especially when you look 1950 and on, it's containment. Yeah. It's doing whatever you can do to keep the Soviets from going any further than they have. And that's why Portugal is in. That's why South Korea joins eventually, why they have the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization to hem in Russia and China in the East. So that's the opting goal. And again, it's this idea, like even though Roosevelt is gone, that idea is still there. It is making the world safe for democracy, but not necessarily democratic. And that's the prevailing, if I can boil it down to one principle, that's it. And the idea is too, what it's sold as is, yeah, okay, these countries aren't democratic, but they're not communist, and then maybe eventually. Maybe by this association, and I mean, and I'm not at all making the case that Greece would have been better off going and falling behind the Iron Curtain. I think the tragedy is that it was presented as that was the choice. And I think you can make that case for a number of other countries that are on this border. And you just need to look at a world map, and then you see that the geography plays a very important role in how these governments are formed, what this idea of stable rather than democratic comes to mean in practice. We see major examples of that in South America throughout the early Cold War. So for me, that's it. That's the overriding principle. And it changes, when we get into détente, or we get into, and then Greece is resigns from the Council of Europe, in 1967, so it's not kicked out.
Mhm.
And then the whole process of Greece's accession afterwards reflect on a change in mentality in the West generally with how we should look at these countries. And Portugal is caught up in that as well. It's not, maybe it's a coincidence, but Portugal, Spain, and Greece all joined the European Economic Community at the same time after emerging from dictatorship. So there is a change on the horizon, but in this time, that horizon is a long way off.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you, Spero. I have a question, follow-up question on the Treaty of Varkis. And the question is as follows. So you mentioned the failure of the Varkis Accord. Do you think it ever had any chance of succeeding, even at the beginning?
I think if they hadn't reversed the order, you know, that's another tragedy for me, is that the wonderful the goodwill that Britain and the United States had worldwide after World War II was remarkable. Ho Chi Minh was talking about the United States as the great ally of the Vietnamese people in 1945 and 46. It's such a missed opportunity and such a tragedy that we know how that turned out. But I think Greece is a little caught up there as well. Because if, I just want to backtrack a little bit because so many things happened in quick succession in 1945 after the war, the fighting in Athens ends. They're saying, well, let's see what kind of a framework can we have? And it's like, well, the communists are here, they're armed, they're organized, they're not going away. Maybe we can find a way for them to participate in a democratic and a liberal democracy. Maybe there's a way for them to participate without going the route of a unitary party state. And that lasts for about 5 minutes because as soon as then the decision is made to flip the order and hold the elections before the plebiscite, that's gone. And a number of other studies focused on works or would say, well, the communists weren't going to honor the agreement because they hid all their weapons. They didn't give their weapons back as they were supposed to at Varkisa. But as soon as the order of those events is reversed, that decision not to turn in the weapons is justified because they can't trust the overseers or the guarantors of democracy that they'll honor their word. Yeah. You know, unfortunately, we can only speculate what would have happened. But if a plebiscite had, what's the worst that would have happened? Okay, the king doesn't come back, but it's still a republic. And it's a liberal democracy. And then in Italy, the Communist Party functioned as part of the Italian government for a long time without turning that country into a communist dictatorship. The same thing in Belgium. And the same thing in France. So for me, so that's the tragedy of Varkisa.
Yeah.
A missed opportunity.
Christine, back to you.
And from our colleague in the history department, John Connolly, who I think you know.
Yes, hi, John.
He just inadvertently answered part of this, but he's asking, would the balance of domestic political forces have allowed for stable parliamentary coalitions? And related to that, Michael Goodman's asking, what were the immediate factors leading to the military coup of April 67? I don't know, those might be related.
Oof, well, no, that's, look, it was a constitutional crisis in 1967. Eerily similar, but not as intense, or sorry, 1951 is eerily similar to what happens. It's again like a precursor. It's like the preface to what's going to come. 1951, the king dissolves parliament, Papagos forms a party and takes over. 1967, it's more dramatic with the king dissolving parliament because he doesn't like the prime minister. And there's a threat that the radical son, Andreas Papandreou, is actually going to be this radical leftist. And then there's a great fear, and Papandreou is arrested at gunpoint trying to get out of his house on the roof. And the CIA tells the Greek army, says, shoot the MF because he's going to come back to haunt you. So it's much more dramatic in 67, no question. Was there, one question, was there a possibility? Well, you know, again, we'll never know. I just see if the terms of Varkisa had been honored, then even if a civil war occurs afterwards, you have the moral justification of saying we honored our commitments. And that plays a role. You see what they describe as lamentable progress is in the Greek army, the national forces, the government forces, is often labeled as a problem of morale. The fact that they just can't make the gains expected of them in spite of their size and equipment because they're just not motivated. And it would be pretty tough to be potentially killing people that you know, or people you know whose towns, where they may be from. And especially considering and knowing what's been going on politically for the previous period of time. In the diplomatic record, they try. The British and the Americans through 46 and 47 are at least on paper in these classified documents committed to establishing a representative parliamentary democracy that includes the communists. But whether or not that was possible was, well, when when the terms are reversed for the communists, they say the political avenue is closed to us. So, yeah, I don't know. I just go back to that again. That's the missed opportunity. Who knows what may have happened?
Spero, let me, since I see that we're coming slowly to the close of our event, so let me take us perhaps to the current time period, because you do make that connection in your book as well, where you specifically write, my experience of living in Greece through the financial crisis had a profound impact on the progression of this book. Could you explain to us why you decided to write that and what impact was that?
Well, I got there in the famous speech of George Papandreou in October 2009, the younger, the grandson. He said, there is money. As the money is there. And the money wasn't there. But it stuck in my mind because I was living on a street in downtown Thessaloniki. And it's almost every week that a shop or a cafe I had gone into was closed the next time I passed it. And this is a country that just 4 years before had hosted the Olympics, or sorry, 5 years before, had won Euro. It certainly wasn't at the same standard of living as downtown, as you might see in downtown London or Paris. But it was, when I got there, it was, well, I didn't notice, it wasn't a shock. It wasn't like I saw something that was falling apart, but in the 3.5 years I was there, it was a huge transformation. I would have people asking me, just handing me their electricity bills, saying, can you pay my bill for me? A random person on the street. And it was just so quick that the change took place from 2009 until 2012. It was shocking. And I was getting frustrated because I would read international press and I'd read descriptions about the Greek government, or I'd read descriptions about the parliament, or I'd read descriptions about the police, or about I say, this sounds eerily familiar to something I just read. A lot of the same rhetoric, very dismissive, very patronizing in some sense, or totally out of touch with what's actually going on. And so there was, if not a factual link, there was certainly kind of a spiritual or an emotional link between what I was reading internationally and what was taking place on the ground when I was there. And I tried to recreate that a little bit in the book. There is an impact.
Excellent. Let me pass it on to Christine, maybe for the final question, Christine, and then I have one last question after that.
Okay, yeah, just someone's wondering, why were the borders considered to be indefensible, the mountainous topography, or what was that characterization based on?
Yeah, I think partially the mountainous terrain, the experience of the German army just crushing the Greek and the British forces a few years before, in spite of these passes and in spite of having trained and motivated Greek and British forces there to oppose them, and nonetheless rode through them like they were not even there. The experience of the recent past, and the fact that how do you patrol that? And with the numbers as well of the countries too, looking at Greece would be attacked by 3 countries, if they were attacked. It would be by 3 countries, 3 different directions, impossible to repulse, in their opinion. And one of the reasons then was why Greece is forced through NATO, because we have to just threaten them that if they attack Greece, they're attacking us. And that worked. Say what you will about NATO, but it did prevent an invasion of all these countries on the border. But that was the reasoning behind it.
Spero, let me then perhaps conclude with a final question. And you know, as a literary scholar, I like to analyze how people begin and how people conclude their books. And you have a very powerful ending, I find. And you end your book with the sentence, there's a lesson. There's a lesson in this for all of us. So how would you phrase that lesson?
Well, on a personal basis, keeping your word matters in your personal relationships, establishing the fact that you have some type of credibility. And I think that applies internationally as well, that principle matters. I think we're often way too cynical about that. Individually in society, you say what, but the value that principle, that conviction have. And that idea too, becoming what you behold, is a warning, because it was clear the transformation, as you read thousands and thousands of documents and dispatches, and you kind of get to know these people a little bit remotely because they have a certain way of writing. They have a certain turn of phrase that they like to use, or where they put their commas or what have you. And you get a sense that you don't know them personally, but you know these people and you see the change taking place. And knowing, and with the benefit of hindsight, you know where it's going. And so knowing that the tragedy is coming and saying, well, the lesson is maybe being aware that your word matter, that principles matter, that conviction matters, doing what you say you're going to do, maybe that can actually have a different result. Maybe there's the optimistic note we can end on.
Yes, very good, Spero. Indeed, we have come to the end of our event. And let me then thank all of you in the audience for being with us here today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Hope to see you at future events at our institute. A big thank you also to my colleague Christine for making time and being with me today as co-moderator. I also would like to thank Ray for the work behind the scenes. And of course, a very big thank you to you, Spero, for making the time, for presenting your book and answering all our questions. I think this was a great event, and I wish you the best of luck with your book and with your career and with your wonderful family in Luxembourg.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you very much, and I look forward very much to joining you guys again in person as soon as possible. We have lots to catch up on. Thank you so much for this today. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you all here. Thank you. Bye-bye.